I thought I had everything under control, until my dad walked in and saw everything. What happened next? Man, you won't believe it. Things got so out of hand, and he did something that changed everything forever. Trust me, you've got to watch till the end. This ending is unreal. The house had been quiet for years now, ever since my parents got divorced. I still remember the shouting, the cold silence that followed, and then the day my mother packed up and left. The home that used to be filled with life felt more like an empty shell. My dad threw himself into his work after the split, leaving me alone most of the time. Well, not entirely alone. There was Jessica, my stepmother. She should have left my father years ago, but she stayed. She was a woman of grace and elegance, the kind of woman who did not seem to age. At 43, she was still beautiful, in a way that seemed effortless. There was something about her, an aura that drew people in, including me. I do not know when exactly my feelings toward her began to change. Maybe it was during those long summer evenings when my dad was away on business trips and Jessica and I were left alone. We would sit out on the porch together, talking about everything and nothing, while the sun slowly dipped below the horizon. The conversations felt easy, natural, and comfortable, too comfortable. It started with stolen glances. I would catch myself looking at her a little too long, noticing how her hair fell over her shoulders, how the soft curve of her neck caught the light just right. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself it was just because she was the only person around. But over time, the tension between us grew. It was like a slow burn that neither of us wanted to acknowledge, but we both felt it. One evening, the air was warm and thick with the scent of summer. Jessica was sitting on the couch in the living room, a book in her hands. I was across from her, pretending to watch TV, but really, I was watching her. Her reading glasses were perched on the edge of her nose, and she absent-mindedly twirled a strand of hair around her finger. I could not take my eyes off her. She must have noticed because she glanced up at me. Her gaze lingered a little longer than usual. "You have been quiet lately," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence of the room. There was something in the way she spoke, something that made me feel like she knew exactly what was on my mind. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I was not sure how to respond, not without revealing too much. "I guess I have just had a lot on my mind," I muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Anything you want to talk about?" she asked, her tone gentle, inviting. My throat tightened. She was offering me an opening, a chance to say what I had been thinking, what we had both been feeling, perhaps. But how could I? She was my stepmother, and these thoughts, these feelings, they were wrong, forbidden. And yet, as wrong as it felt, I could not stop thinking about her. I shook my head. "No, not really." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You know you can talk to me, right?" Her voice was soft, almost too soft, and her eyes, God, her eyes. They were watching me, studying me, as if searching for something. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she felt the same. That thought terrified me and thrilled me at the same time. I nodded, but I could not hold her gaze. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I could feel the pull between us growing stronger, and I knew I had to get out of there before I did something stupid. I need some air," I mumbled, standing up abruptly. I could feel her eyes on me as I made my way out onto the porch. The cool evening breeze hit my skin, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. I leaned against the railing, staring out at the darkening sky, my thoughts racing. How the hell had I let myself get here? How could I let myself feel this way about her? I heard the soft creak of the porch door behind me, and a moment later, Jessica stepped out. She stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, charged with everything we were not saying. After a long pause, she broke the silence. "You know, I have always thought you were different," she said quietly. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to face her. "Different how?" She smiled, that same small, secretive smile. "You are not like your father. You are more sensitive, more in tune with things." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Was she just being kind? Or was there something more to what she was saying? I wanted to ask, wanted to push further, But before I could, she reached out and lightly touched my arm. It was the softest of touches, barely more than a brush of her fingers, but it sent a jolt through me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The air between us felt electric. She hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to go any further. Then, almost imperceptibly, she moved closer. I could smell the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the evening air. My breathing became shallow, my pulse racing. "Jessica," I whispered, though I was not sure what I was going to say next. But before I could say anything else, she leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was tentative at first, almost as if she was testing the waters. But then I kissed her back. I could not help myself. The feel of her lips on mine, the warmth of her body so close to mine, it was intoxicating. It was everything I had been trying so hard to avoid, and now there was no turning back. She pulled away suddenly, her eyes wide, filled with shock and guilt. I should not have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am sorry." But I stepped forward, closing the distance between us again. "Do not apologize," I said, my voice low. "Please, do not apologize for something that felt so right." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, we just stood there, inches apart, both of us caught between what we knew was wrong and the undeniable pull that was drawing us together. "We should stop," she murmured, but there was no conviction in her voice. Her gaze flicked down to my lips, and I knew she was just as torn as I was. "I know," I whispered back, though the words felt hollow. Neither of us moved. Neither of us could. The tension between us was too thick, too heavy. We had crossed a line, and deep down, we both knew there was no going back. As she turned and went back inside, the kiss lingered on my lips, and the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on my chest. Nothing was ever going to be the same again. The days that followed that kiss were a blur. I could not think straight. I could not sleep. I could not focus on anything except her. "Jessica?" I replayed the kiss over and over in my head, wondering if I had imagined it, if it had even happened. But every time I saw her, I knew it had been real. The tension between us, the electricity in the air when we were in the same room. It was undeniable. We tried to avoid each other at first, both of us pretending like nothing had happened. She would stay in the kitchen or the garden, and I would keep to my room, trying to convince myself that I could just forget about it. But the house was not big enough to hide. Every time I caught a glimpse of her, the way she moved, the way her hair fell across her shoulders, that same rush of emotion came flooding back. One evening, about a week after the kiss, I found myself in the kitchen, grabbing a drink. Jessica was at the sink, washing dishes. I could feel her presence before I even walked in. My heart started racing as soon as I saw her. I told myself to leave, to turn around and walk out, but my feet did not listen. I stood there, frozen in place, watching her. She must have felt my eyes on her, because she turned around, drying her hands on a towel. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the air thick with everything unsaid. "Hey," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "Hey," she replied, her eyes searching mine, as if she was trying to read my thoughts. There was a hesitation in her voice, but also something else, something unspoken but clear. She was feeling it too. I could not take it anymore. I could not stand the silence, the tension, the distance between us. I moved closer to her, my heart pounding in my chest. She did not back away. If anything, she stepped closer too, as if drawn to me against her better judgment. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and steady, though inside I was anything but. She nodded, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "I know," she whispered, "but I do not even know where to start." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I knew what she meant. How do you begin to talk about something that you know is so wrong, yet feels so right? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Jessica, that night, I cannot stop thinking about it." Her lips parted, and I saw a flicker of emotion cross her face. She was torn, just like I was. She wanted to say something, but the words would not come. "I know we should not have," I began. But before I could finish, she closed the distance between us. Her hand reached out, gently resting on my arm. The touch was light, but it set off a fire inside me. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper, "we cannot keep doing this. We have to stop." But her hand did not move. Neither did mine. I looked down at her fingers, resting against my skin, and I knew. We were not going to stop. Neither of us could. The pull between us was too strong. I took a step closer, and she did not move away. My hand reached up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She closed her eyes at the touch, her breath hitching. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure she could hear it. "We need to stop," she whispered again. But her voice was weak, unconvincing. "Do you want to?" I asked, my voice low, the question hanging between us like a challenge. She opened her eyes and met my gaze. The look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She was fighting it, just like I was. But we both knew the truth. We did not want to stop, not even close. Slowly, almost cautiously, I leaned in. She did not pull away. Her breath caught in her throat as I brought my lips close to hers, just inches apart. For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension was unbearable, and then, in an instant, it snapped. She kissed me. This time, it was not tentative or hesitant. This time, it was full of need, desire, and something much deeper. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and she melted into me. Her fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me deeper into the kiss. I could feel her heartbeat racing against mine, the warmth of her body pressed against me, and I knew there was no turning back now. We broke apart only for a moment, both of us breathless. Her eyes searched mine, filled with a mixture of lust and fear. "Ethan, what are we doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I do not know," I admitted, my hands still on her waist, "but I do not want to stop." Neither did she. I could see it in her eyes. We were both lost in this now, caught up in something that was spinning out of control, but neither of us cared. We kissed again, deeper this time, more desperate. My hands roamed her body, feeling every curve, every soft line. She moaned softly against my lips, her fingers digging into my shoulders as she pulled me closer. I could feel the heat between us growing, the air around us thick with desire. Suddenly, she pulled back, her breathing ragged. We have to be careful," she said, her voice shaky. "Your father, he cannot know." The mention of my dad hit me like a bucket of cold water. For a moment, reality crashed back down around us. What we were doing was dangerous, forbidden. If he ever found out, I did not even want to think about what would happen. But then she touched me again, her fingers trailing down my arm, and all rational thought disappeared. I did not care. Not in that moment. "We will be careful," I promised, though I had no idea how we were going to pull it off. She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We both knew this was a risk, a dangerous game we were playing, but the pull was too strong, too intoxicating. We could not stop, even if we wanted to. For a while, we just stood there in the kitchen, our bodies close, the reality of what we were doing sinking in. I could feel the weight of it, but at the same time, I could not bring myself to let go. I did not want to. Finally, she stepped back, putting some distance between us. Her face was flushed, her breathing still uneven. "We need to be smart about this," she said, her voice steadier now. "We cannot let anyone know, especially your father." I nodded, though inside, I was already thinking about when I could be alone with her again. The thought of sneaking around, of stealing moments with her in secret, sent a thrill through me. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also exhilarating. As she turned to leave, I reached out and grabbed her hand, stopping her. She looked back at me, her eyes questioning. "When can I see you again?" I asked, my voice low, filled with need. She hesitated, biting her lip. "We have to be careful," she repeated, but the look in her eyes told me she wanted it just as much as I did. "Tomorrow," she finally said. "Your dad is working late. We can meet by the lake." I nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. The tension between us was palpable, and I could already feel the anticipation building. Tomorrow could not come fast enough. As she left the kitchen, I stood there, my heart still racing. I knew what we were doing was dangerous, that it could tear everything apart if we were not careful. But right then, I did not care. All I could think about was her, Jessica, the way her lips felt against mine, the way her body fit so perfectly against me. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. The next day felt like it lasted forever. My heart raced with anticipation every time I thought about what was going to happen later. I could not focus on anything. Not work, not conversations, not even the sounds of the house around me. My mind was filled with Jessica. Her touch, her kiss, the way her body felt so close to mine. Finally, when the sun began to set, I knew it was time. My dad had left for another late night at the office, just as Jessica had said he would. I tried to act casual as I walked out of the house, heading toward the lake at the edge of our property. But inside, I was anything but calm. The path to the lake was narrow and winding, lined with tall grass that swayed in the warm summer breeze. I could feel the anticipation building with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms sweaty with the thrill of what was about to happen. I knew this was dangerous, that we were on the verge of something that could destroy everything. But I did not care. Not in that moment. When I finally reached the lake, Jessica was already there. She was standing by the water's edge, her back to me, watching the ripples dance across the surface. The setting sun bathed her in a soft, golden glow, making her look even more beautiful than I remembered. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her, unable to believe this was really happening. She must have sensed my presence, because she turned around slowly, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You came," she said, her voice quiet, but filled with something deeper, something that made my chest tighten. "I couldn't stay away," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. I took a step toward her, and then another, until I was standing right in front of her. The air between us was thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse quicken as I reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She closed her eyes at the touch, her breath hitching. "We shouldn't be doing this," she murmured, but her body leaned into mine, her hand resting lightly on my chest. "I know," I whispered back, though the words felt empty. We both knew we should stop. We both knew this was wrong, but neither of us moved. Neither of us wanted to stop. Without thinking, I leaned down and kissed her again, my lips meeting hers in a slow, deliberate motion. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and she melted into me, her arms wrapping around my neck as she deepened the kiss. The taste of her, the warmth of her body pressed against mine. It was intoxicating. As we kissed, my hands slid down her back, feeling the soft curve of her hips, the way her body fit so perfectly against mine. I could feel her heartbeat racing, matching my own, and the heat between us grew stronger, more intense. Every touch, every kiss, sent a shiver down my spine, making me want more. She pulled away slightly, her lips brushing against my ear. "Ethan," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin. "This is dangerous." "I don't care," I murmured, my hands still on her waist, pulling her even closer. "I want you." Her eyes fluttered open, meeting mine, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between us. The world around us seemed to disappear. The lake, the trees, the fading light, none of it mattered. All that mattered was her, standing there in my arms, looking at me like she wanted this just as much as I did. "I want you too," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. "But we have to be careful." "We will be," I promised, though even as I said it, I knew it would not be easy. What we were doing was risky, forbidden, but that only made it more exciting, more thrilling. She kissed me again, harder this time, her fingers tangling in my hair as she pulled me closer. I could feel the heat between us growing, the tension building to a point where it felt like it would explode at any moment. My hands roamed her body, feeling every curve, every soft line. She moaned softly against my lips, her nails digging into my shoulders as she pressed herself against me. For a moment, it felt like the world was spinning out of control, like we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous and exhilarating. And then, just as suddenly, she pulled away, her breathing ragged, her eyes wide with fear and desire. We have to stop," she said, though her voice was shaky, filled with uncertainty. "If your father ever found out?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad. I had been so caught up in the moment, so wrapped up in her, that I had completely forgotten about him. If he ever found out about this, I did not even want to think about what would happen. But then she touched me again, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm, and all rational thought disappeared. I could not stop. I did not want to stop. "We'll be careful," I repeated, though I was not sure how we could be. She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We both knew this was a dangerous game we were playing, and the stakes were higher than either of us wanted to admit. But the pull between us was too strong. We were both in too deep. For a while, we just stood there by the lake, our bodies close, the reality of what we were doing sinking in. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, but at the same time, I could not bring myself to let go. I did not want to. Finally, she stepped back, putting some distance between us. Her face was flushed, her breathing still uneven. "We need to be smart about this," she said, her voice more controlled now. "We can't let anyone know, especially your father." "I know," I replied, though inside, I was already thinking about when I could be alone with her again. The thought of sneaking around, of stealing moments with her in secret, sent a thrill through me. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also exhilarating. As the light faded and the stars began to appear in the sky, we finally left the lake and walked back to the house, careful not to be seen together. The whole time, I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken promise of what was to come. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of Jessica, her touch, her kiss, the way her body felt against mine. I knew this was wrong, that what we were doing could destroy everything. But I also knew that I could not stop. Not now. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and I had already crossed it. The next few days were a blur of stolen moments and fleeting touches. Jessica and I kept pushing the boundaries, unable to resist the magnetic pull between us. We were reckless, careless. Each meeting became riskier, and every touch felt like fire. I was addicted to her, and it was clear she felt the same way. But the closer we got, the more I felt the looming shadow of my father over us. One night, when my father was supposed to be away on another business trip, Jessica and I found ourselves alone again. This time, there was a sense of urgency in the air. Like we both knew this might be our last chance to be together without consequences. She was waiting for me in the living room, her dress clinging to her body in a way that made my heart race. I sat down next to her, and as soon as our eyes met, it was as if everything else in the world disappeared. I leaned in, kissing her deeply, my hands sliding down her waist, pulling her close. She responded immediately, her fingers tangling in my hair, her breath quickening as our kisses grew more urgent. "We shouldn't," she whispered between kisses, her lips brushing against mine. "We should stop." But I couldn't stop. Neither could she. The heat between us was unbearable, and we were both too far gone to turn back now. My hands roamed over her body, feeling the curve of her hips, the softness of her skin. Her moans filled the room, and it was all I could do to keep myself from losing control. Just as things were about to go further than they ever had before, we heard the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. The sound was like a cold shock to both of us. We froze, our bodies still entangled, as the reality of what we were doing hit us like a wave. Jessica's eyes went wide with fear, and my stomach dropped as I realized who had just come home early. My father. I scrambled to sit up, my heart pounding in my chest. Jessica quickly straightened her dress, her hands shaking as she tried to make herself look presentable. But it was too late. We both knew it was too late. Footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder with each passing second. Panic surged through me. My father would know. There was no way he wouldn't see what was going on. He appeared in the doorway, his face dark with suspicion. His eyes flicked between Jessica and me, lingering on the space between us, too close. The tension in the room was suffocating. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice cold and sharp. I opened my mouth to say something, to lie, to explain it away, but nothing came out. I was paralyzed by fear, guilt eating me alive. Jessica stood up quickly, trying to salvage the situation. John, it's not what it looks like. But my father wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on me, rage building behind them like a storm ready to break. Not what it looks like? He spat. I'm not an idiot, Jessica. I know exactly what's been going on. He stepped forward, and I could see the veins bulging in his neck, the barely contained fury. My heart pounded in my ears as he reached into the cabinet beside the door, his hand shaking as he pulled out his hunting rifle. Dad, wait! I shouted, stepping between him and Jessica, but his eyes were wild, filled with betrayal. How long? He growled, his voice trembling with rage. How long have you two been doing this behind my back? John, please, put the gun down, Jessica pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. She stepped forward, reaching out toward him, but the movement was enough to push him over the edge. Don't you dare, he roared, lifting the rifle and pointing it directly at her. Time seemed to slow down. I watched in horror as his finger tightened on the trigger, and before I could even react, the deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the room. Jessica's body jerked violently as the bullet hit her. Her eyes widened in shock as she stumbled back, clutching her stomach. Blood seeped through her fingers, staining the front of her dress as she crumpled to the floor. No! I screamed, rushing to her side, dropping to my knees beside her. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. I pressed my hands over the wound, desperately trying to stop the bleeding, but it was no use. The blood kept pouring out, warm and thick between my fingers. Jessica, stay with me, I begged, my voice cracking with panic. Please, stay with me. Her eyes fluttered open, her hand weakly reaching up to touch my face. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. I'm so sorry. Tears blurred my vision as I held her, her life slipping away in my arms. I could hear my father's heavy breathing behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. All I could see was Jessica, her face, her eyes, the love and regret mixed with the pain. I don't know how long I knelt there, holding her as she took her last breath. The world around me had collapsed, shattered into pieces. Jessica was gone, and everything we had shared, everything I had felt for her, had been torn apart in a single moment of violence. When I finally turned around, my father was standing there, the rifle still in his hands, his face pale with shock at what he had done. He looked at me, his eyes wide with regret, but I couldn't feel anything but hatred. He had taken her from me. He had destroyed everything. What have you done? I whispered, my voice trembling with rage and grief. What have you done? He dropped the rifle, his hands shaking, and took a step back, as if realizing the full weight of his actions. But it was too late. The damage was done. I didn't mean to, he stammered, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to, but I didn't care. Nothing he said could undo what had just happened. Nothing could bring her back. I stood up slowly, the blood from Jessica's body still staining my hands, and looked at him one last time. You killed her, I said, my voice hollow. You killed her. And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving him standing there, his world, our world, in ruins.